NASBO is pleased to present the report, State Budgeting and Lessons Learned from the Economic Downturn, Analysis and Commentary from State Budget Officers.
We only had $2.2 million in our rainy day fund, which is enough to run government for about 30 minutes.
We had reserves available, but we coupled them with cuts.
The revenue in slope down was so steep.
An $800 million shortfall out of a $3.2 billion budget.
The recession lingered long after it was declared over.
Even though the downturn is over, what's so important about this report is we are facing some tough challenges at the state level. And so this report summarizes how states can learn from the past, the recent past, and think about how they can approach future uncertainty.
We made the cuts really span all of state government. We had buy-in from literally every agency in state government and all three branches of government on the cuts.
First word of advice I would give is know your statutory powers. Literally take your code home, make sure you know what powers rest with you.
The revenue in slope down was so steep that you respond to that in the future by growing programs more slowly, by trying to limit. A new program now would have much more scrutiny before it could be added to the budget. We're subject to ups and downs outside of our control, and so they will grow more cautiously in the future.
Some budget directors may start to feel pressure, not only from their governor, their cabinet, but also the legislature, to fall back into old habits, to want to add back the programs that we cut. But that experience, like living through the Great Depression, should stay with us. We need to not forget how difficult it was to cut those programs that had been, existed for years, and adding them back would probably be not a wise move, given that the economy still probably isn't as strong as where we'd like it to be.
Get accurate information based on data and facts. Secondarily would be to determine what's in the best interest of the state. How do we reduce the budget? When do we use the rainy day fund? Do that and decide that based upon what's the best fiscal response that the state can give. And then once that plan's decided, then look at the politics of it all.
When bad times come and you have to ask other branches of government to cut budgets and to consider doing away with programs, having a good working relationship with those individuals really pays dividends to a state budget office, to a governor, and helps to mitigate and get buy-in from all of the branches of government.
As part of the Great Recession, we actually moved to a 10-year budgeting process, not developing a budget for 10 years, but using expenditure and revenue outlooks for the next 10 years to guide where we were making individual decisions for the specific 2-year period. Looking for the long term and trying to figure out where is the best investment that we can make that positions our economy to grow out of this in the future.
States need to plan on an idea that there will be times when they have to rely on themselves first, and the strong rainy day fund is the way we hit on doing that.
There's a heightened awareness and probably greater support for the need to replenish your rainy day fund and maintain it at a level perhaps higher than people historically have thought was necessary.
Prior to the downturn, Utah statute required that a certain portion of any revenue surplus was transferred into the rainy day funds up to a threshold of 6% for our general fund, which really helped us to build those rainy day funds up and have sufficient funds available for the downturn. After the downturn, that cap has been raised from 6% up to 7%.
Really, those are to address short-term funding needs, to give our legislature an opportunity to provide a longer-term fix.
We didn't tap the rainy day fund for any of the critical needs in state services, and I think it proved well that we were able to find savings throughout the rest of state government without doing that, without laying people off.
In Oregon, the Recovery Act was really critical. It helped avoid some of the catastrophic cuts to both education programs and human services programs that we would have had to make if the federal government didn't participate. So it was extremely important to maintain critical programs in the midst of the recession, but then we had to have a plan for how we would exit out the other side.
There were a number of federal grant awards that were increased, potentially creating an expectation and potentially even a demand that they be continued with state resources at some point in the future. So that provided for some complications.
The funding that was provided under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, Arkansas went to great lengths to make sure that we used those funds for one-time capital purposes.
The economy wasn't quite where it should be, where everyone hoped it would be when the stimulus funds ran out. So we were still faced with making some difficult decisions, but we had a longer runway to be able to address those and really evaluate those programs when stimulus funding ran out.
Every state, as they review their tax system, which probably happens to greater or lesser degree every session, ought to try to aim for a tax and a revenue system that reflects the overall economy.
There are certain revenue sources that are more volatile than others. A way to manage through that volatility would be to earmark a portion of those types of revenues for rainy day funds.
And our governor's been very adamant about being conservative on the front end of the revenue estimating process, asking the legislature to construct a budget that lives within those conservative revenue estimates. And then we've been coming back the next year when we actually have the revenue in hand and spending the remaining amounts or the surpluses.
The states really learned some great lessons on how to approach budget cutting, which the federal government and others are going to have to approach in the future.
If you have to make budget cuts, to attempt to do those as early in the year as possible in order that agencies can absorb those reductions over the period of a year.
We made the cuts really span all of state government. We had buy-in from literally every agency in state government and all three branches of government on the cuts.
We had reserves available, but we coupled them with cuts so that we didn't spend all of our reserves early. We actually made the decision that we were going to make cuts and use some reserves until we could see the backside of the recession, and then we could start smoothing out the trough so that we wouldn't be making catastrophic cuts.
So what we did immediately is we put the budget in structural balance. We went through prioritized spending, looked at the actual programs. We didn't do any across-the-board cuts like they're doing in the federal level, sequestration. We actually got the data, looked at the programs, and reduced the spending in those areas. We
in the budget office see these big numbers every day. And so we're used to the comparative analysis between what something cost, $100,000, $1 million, $100 million. So we explained to people how big the problem was. And once we did that, we had a lot more buy-in and a lot more support for the cuts that we had to make. If we would have just led with, this is the program we're going to cut, and people didn't really understand the problem, I think our challenges would have been more difficult.
When you are in the kind of situation most states have been in the last 4 or 5 years, most of your attention is focused on the immediate because it has to be. And while you're doing that, sometimes the longer term priorities, things like infrastructure, get shoved to the back of the discussion. Now it's time we're through the crisis, it's time to shift our focus to some longer term and future centered priorities.
Really, again, looking for the long term and trying to figure out where is the best investment that we can make that positions our economy to grow out of this in the future.
This report will be particularly critical for the future so that experts, policy analysts, budget officers will know what lessons were learned and how they can utilize those lessons for the future.